Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and this is the Varietal Literature YouTube page. If you've never been here before, we're a group of writers from Vancouver who just like to have fun with narrative. If you would like to read our own original stories, short stories, poems, nonfiction, choose your own adventures sort of things, you can check out in the description below. Varietal-literature.ca is our website. Tonight though, we're doing Fairy and Folk Tales, as we do every Tuesday nights at 6:30 on Fireside Fairytales, full circle. This is a live broadcast, but if you are not watching it live, you should know that there will be timestamps in the description below, and those timestamps will take you to each of the stories that we read tonight. If you want to skip over this and get straight to certain things, it's easy enough to do. That's why I put it there. Or if you only want to hear one or two stories or whatever else. We are going to read 2 stories tonight, maybe 3, but I don't think so, because I don't think we're going to have time. The first story we're going to read is called All I Possess, which you see up on the screen right now. All I Possess is a story from a book called Fairytales from the Swedish by somebody named Björklo, I think is his name. It's an old book, so you can get it from Project Gutenberg. If you don't know, that's where most of our books come from. But the way I encountered it, which I will bring up, is the same book from last week, which is this book, which is a book of public domain stories with pretty pictures. And, well, I just liked it, even though you can get all the stories in it for free. So we've been reading stories from this that I've liked, and the theme tonight is stories that deal with pardon me, stories that deal with murdering women, not the murder of women murdering things. And that's the first 2 stories. If we do end up reading the third story, there is a murder. It is related to a woman. There's an attempted murder as well, but it doesn't fit the theme as well. So All I Possess is a shorter story from Fairytales from the Swedish that I encountered in that book, that deals with the murder, the murdering of a woman. No, a woman who is a murderer. The way I'm saying that makes it sound wrong. The other is from a book called Icelandic Legends, which is also up on the screen, called Hildur, the Queen of the Elves, which is a bit longer and a little bit more tragic, but also deals with essentially a serial killer of a woman. And why is that the theme tonight? No particular reason. It was just, I'd read through some pieces and I was like, hey, these 2 pieces are about women who go around and murder people. And that's from John Arneson. Again, it's an older book, and again, it's a story that I encountered first in this book. Okay. So that's the plan for tonight, to read those 2 stories. We'll see how the time looks at the end of Hildur, the Queen of the Elves. And if that's okay, then there is a longer story that I would like to read from another book. But if we don't have time to do it, I will do it next week. And I see GS says, good evening. Good evening, GS. And by the way, if you are here live, you can watch us, or you can talk to me in the live chat, and I'll talk to you mainly in between stories. Pardon me, I meant to mute my mic. Forgot that. Hopefully that was good ASMR. All right. This story is called All I Possess, from Fairytales from the Swedish by Björklo. And it is a traditional tale. There was once a farmer who was so stingy and close-fisted that he could scarcely find it in his heart to eat anything. And as for giving anything away to anybody, that was quite out of the question. He wanted to accustom his wife to do without eating. But it fared with her as with the peddler's mare. She died from an overdose of that doctrine, and so he had to find another wife in her stead. And although he was what he was, there were plenty of girls who made themselves agreeable to him, and were willing to begin where his wife had left off. For you must know he was rich, the ugly fellow, and it was his money they were after, although they knew they would have to suffer a little in return. But he was not satisfied with any of them, for if they ate ever so little, they were sure to want something to eat. Those who were stout and comely would be too expensive to keep, and those who were thin and slender were sure to have a big appetite. So he was not able to find anyone to his liking, although he had been all over the parish looking for one. But the lad on the farm came to his assistance. He had heard of a girl in one of the neighboring parishes who was not even able to eat as much as a whole pea at one meal, but made it do for two. Sorry. The farmer was glad to hear this. She was the girl he would like to have, and although she was somewhat deaf, so that she never heard more than half of what people said to her, he lost no time in proposing to the girl. Her father and mother said yes at once, seeing that the suitor was so rich, and it did not take him long to persuade the girl herself. A husband she must have some time or another, and so they clinched the matter, and the farmer entered into wedlock for the second time. What a weird word to get caught up on. But after a time, he began to wonder how his wife really managed to keep alive, for he noticed that she never took a morsel of food or even drank so much as a drop of water. But this, he thought, was altogether too little. For he noticed, she seemed to thrive very well for all of that, and he even thought she was getting a little stouter. I wonder if she's deceiving me, he thought. So one day, when he was driving home from his work in the fields, he happened to meet his wife, who was coming from the cowshed with the milk. I wonder if she doesn't take a sip of the milk when she is straining it, he thought, and so he asked the lad to help him up on the roof and pulled the damper aside, for he wanted to look down the chimney and see what his wife was doing. And this he did. He climbed up on the roof and put his head down the chimney, peering and prying all he could. The lad then went in to his mistress. "Master is now looking down the chimney," he said. "Down the chimney," said the wife. "Well, then you must put some faggots on the hearth and make a fire." Again, in this time, faggot means a bundle of sticks. "I daren't," said the lad. "If you daren't, I dare," said the woman, and so she made a fire and blew into it. The farmer began shouting, for the smoke was nearly suffocating him. "Bless me, is that you, husband?" said his wife. "Yes, of course it is," said the farmer. "Why are you hanging there for?" she said. "Oh, I was, longing so much for you, wifey, that I went the shortest way," he said, and then he fell down on the earth and burned himself a good deal. Some days passed, and his wife neither ate nor drank, but if she did not grow stouter, she did not become thinner. "I wonder if she doesn't eat some of the bacon when she goes to the storehouse," he thought, and so he stole into the storehouse and ripped up one end of a large feather bed which was lying there. He crept into it and asked the lad to sew the ticking together again. The lad did as he was bid, and then he went in to his mistress. "Master is now lying inside the feather bed in the storehouse," he said. "Inside the feather bed in the storehouse," said his wife. "You must go and beat it well, so that neither dust nor moss get into it," she said, and so she took down a couple of stout hazel sticks and gave them to the lad. "I daren't," said the lad. "If you daren't, I dare," said the wife, and she went to the storehouse and began to beat the feather bed with all her might, so that the feathers flew about, and the farmer began shouting, for the blows hit him right across his face. "Bless me, is that you, husband?" said the woman. "Yes, of course it is," said the farmer. "What are you lying there for?" said his wife. "I thought I would lie on something better than straw for once," said the husband. They then ripped open the feather bed, and when he came out, the blood was still streaming down his face. Some days then passed, and the wife neither ate nor drank, but her husband thought she was growing still stouter and more cheerful than ever. "The devil knows what's at the bottom of all of this," he thought. "I wonder if she drinks the beer when she goes into the cellar." And so he went down into the cellar and knocked the bottom out of an empty beer barrel. And then he crept into the barrel and asked the lad to put the bottom in again. The lad did as he was bid, and then he went to his mistress. "Master is now lying in the beer barrel in the cellar," said the lad. "In the beer barrel in the cellar," said the wife. "You must fill it with boiling juniper lye, for it's getting sour and leaky," she said. "I daren't," said the lad. "Well, if you daren't, I dare," said the wife, and so she began boiling juniper lye, and then she poured it into the barrel. The farmer began to shout, but she poured a whole kettleful into the barrel, and yet another after that. The man went on shouting louder and louder, till she went, "Bless me, is that you, husband?" said the wife. "Yes, of course it is," yelled the farmer. "What are you lying there for?" said his wife. But the farmer was not able to give any answer. He only moaned and groaned, for he was terribly scalded. And when they got him out of the barrel, he was more dead than alive, and they had to carry him to his bed. He now wished to see the parson, and while the lad went to fetch him, the wife began to prepare some tasty dishes, and to make cheesecakes and other nice things for the parson, so that he would not go away with an empty stomach. But when the farmer saw how lavish she was in preparing all the dishes, he shouted still louder than when he was scalded, "All I possess! All I possess!" he cried, for he now believed they were going to eat up everything he had, and he knew that both the parson and the clerk were people who could make themselves at home and make a clean sweep of the table. When the parson arrived, the farmer was still shouting, "All I possess! All I possess!" "What is it your husband is saying?" said the parson. "Oh, my husband is so terribly good and kind," said the wife. "He means that I shall have all that he possesses." "His words must be considered and looked upon as an intimation of his last will and testament," said the parson. "Just so," said the wife. "All I possess! All I possess!" cried the farmer. And then he died. His wife then had him buried, and afterwards she went to the proper authorities about her husband's affair. And as both the parson and the clerk could give evidence, the farmer's last words were that she should have all he possessed. She got it all. And when a year was gone, she married the lad on the farm. But whether after that time she was just as hard as hearing, I have never heard. Gia says this would make a hilarious show. I guess except for when he gets poured out with a bunch of lye burns. That story is all I possess. That was the end of that first story. It's weird because it's presented in this kind of cutesy way, but truthfully, she just murdered a man knowingly, and it's presented as like isn't that cute? Okay. The second story we're going to read is a bit longer, a little bit more bleak. Well, not bleak. Bleak's the wrong word. It is more... Sorry, just a second here. We're having... Just have to fix something for a moment. And... should fix it. GS says a cute murder story. Yeah. It kind of slips past you how grim it is at first. And pull that down just a bit more. Sorry, I'm fussing about something that I'm sure nobody cares about, but I do. And there we go. The next story is also about a woman who murders people. It's pretty obvious early on, though I think it's meant to be a bit of a twist. But that's not the most interesting part of the story anyways. So, the ending in particular, I have questions for chat about. We'll see how long it takes to read this story, because the other story I'm looking at reading is about equivalent length. And depending on that, we may read a third story tonight, or we may call it a bit early with this one. We'll see how long it takes. This one's called Hildur, the Queen of the Elves. Whoa, 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 whoa. Hey, come on. Play nice. There we go. It's from the book Icelandic Legends. Sorry. Let me get a drink of water. Pull my thoughts together. This is the story Hildur, the Queen of the Elves, from the book Icelandic Legends by John Arneson. Once in a mountainous district there lived a certain farmer whose name and that of his farm have not been handed down to us, so we cannot tell them. He was unmarried and had a housekeeper named Hildur, concerning whose family and descent he knew nothing whatever. She had all the indoor affairs of the farm under her charge and managed them wondrous well. All the inmates of the house, the farmer himself to boot, were fond of her, as she was clean and thrifty in her habits, and kind and gentle in speech. Everything about the place flourished exceedingly, but the farmer had always found the greatest difficulty in hiring a herdsman, a very important matter, as the well-being of the farm depended not a little on the care taken of the sheep. This difficulty did not arise from any fault of the farmer's own, or from neglect on the part of the housekeeper to the comforts of the servants, but from the fact that no herdsman who entered his service lived more than a year, each one being without fail found dead in his bed on the morning of Christmas Day. No wonder, therefore, the farmer found herdsmen scarce. In those times it was the custom of the country to spend the night of Christmas Eve at church, and this occasion for service was looked upon as a very solemn one. But so far as his farm from the church, that the herdsmen who did not return from their flocks till late in the evening were unable to go to it on that night until long after the usual time, and as for Hildur, she always remained behind to take care of the house. She always had so much to do in the way of cleaning the rooms and dealing out the rations for the servants, that the family used to come home from church and go to bed long before she had finished her work and was able to go to bed herself. The more the reports of the death of herdsman after herdsman on the night of Christmas Eve were spread abroad, the greater the difficulty the farmer found in hiring one, although it was never supposed for an instant that violence was used towards the men, as no mark had ever been found upon their body, and as, moreover, there was no one to suspect. At length the farmer declared that his conscience would no longer let him thus hire men only in order that they might die. So he determined in future to let luck take care of his sheep, or the sheep take care of themselves. Not long after he'd made this determination, a bold and hardy-looking man came to him and made him a proffer of his services. The farmer said, "My good friend, I am not in so great a need of your services as to hire you." Then the man asked him, "Have you not, then, taken a herdsman for this winter?" The farmer said, "No. I suppose you know what a terrible fate has hitherto befallen everyone I have hired." "I have heard of it," said the other, "but the fear of it shall neither trouble me, nor prevent me keeping your sheep this winter for you, if you will but make up your mind to take me." But the farmer would not hear of it. "For," said he, "it is a pity indeed that so fine a fellow as you should lose your chance of life. Begone if you are wise. Get work elsewhere." Yet the man declared again and again that he cared not a whit for the terrors of Christmas Eve, and still urged the farmer to hire him. At length the farmer consented, in answer to the man's urgent prayer, to take him as a herdsman. And very well they agreed together, for everyone both high and low liked the man, as he was honest and open, zealous in everything he laid his hands to, and willing to do anyone a good turn if need were. On Christmas Eve, towards nightfall, the farmer and all his family went, as has been declared to be the custom, to church, except Hildur, who remained behind to look after household matters, and the herdsman, who could not leave his sheep in time. Late in the evening, the latter, as usual, returned home, and after having eaten his supper, went to bed. As soon as he was well between the sheets, the remembrance struck him of what had befallen all the former herdsmen in his position on the same evening, and he thought it would be the best plan for him to lie awake and thus be ready for any accident, though he was mighty little troubled with fear. Quite late at night he heard the farmer and his family return from church, enter the house, and having taken supper, go to bed. Still, nothing happened, except that whenever he closed his eyes for a moment, a strange and deadly faintness stole over him, which only acted as one reason the more for his doing to keep his best to keep awake. Shortly after he'd become aware of these feelings, he heard someone creep stealthily up the side of his bed, and looking through the gloom at the figure, fancied he recognized Hildur, the housekeeper. So he feigned to be fast asleep and felt her place something in his mouth, which he knew instantly to be the bit of a magic bridle, but yet allowed her to fix it on him without moving. When she had fastened the bridle, she dragged him from the bed and out of the farmhouse without his being either able or willing to make the least resistance. Then mounting on his back, she made him rise from the ground as if on wings, and rode him through the air until they arrived at a huge and awful precipice which yawned like a great well down to the earth. Bet you didn't see that coming, did you? She dismounted at a large stone, and fastening the reins to it, leapt into the precipice. But the herdsman, objecting strongly to being tied to the stone all night, and there's a nice picture for you. Unfortunately, these are PDFs. We didn't have EPUB versions of these stories tonight, so I can't show you the whole thing like I normally do. That's her basically leaping away, I believe. Thinking to himself that it would be no bad thing to know what became of the woman, tried to escape, bridle and all, from the stone. This he found, however, to be impossible, for as long as the bit was in his mouth, he was quite powerless to get away. So he managed after a short struggle to get the bridle off his head, and having done so, leapt into the precipice, down which he'd seen Hildur disappear. After sinking for a long, long time, he caught a glimpse of Hildur beneath him, and at last they came to some beautiful green meadows. From all this, the man guessed that Hildur was by no means a common mortal. The magic bridle didn't give that away there, bud? As she had before made believe to be, and feared if he were to follow her along these green fields, she would turn round and catch sight of him. He might not unlikely pay for his curiosity with his life. So he took a magic stone, which he always carried about with him, the nature of which was to make him invisible when he held it in his palm, and placing it in the hollow of his hand, ran after her with all his strength. Love old storytelling. Here's a random thing we haven't established. It's there now. Everything's fine. When they had some way along the meadow, a splendid palace rose before them, with a way to which Hildur seemed perfectly well acquainted. At her approach, a great crowd of people came forth from the doors and saluted Hildur with respect and joy. Foremost of these walked a man of kingly and noble aspect, whose salutation seemed to be that of a lover or a husband. All the rest bowed to her as if she were their queen. This man was accompanied by 2 children, who ran up to Hildur, calling her mother, and embraced her. After the people had welcomed their queen, they all returned to the palace, where they dressed her in royal robes, and loaded her hands with costly rings and bracelets. The herdsman followed the crowd and posted himself where he would be least in the way of the company, but where he could catch sight easily of all that passed and lose nothing. So gorgeous and dazzling were the hangings of the hall and the silver and golden vessels on the table, that he thought he'd never in all his life before seen the like, not to mention the wonderful dishes and wines which seemed to be plentiful there, and which only by the look of them filled his mouth with water, while he would much rather have filled it with something else. After he'd waited a little time, Hildur appeared in the hall, and all the assembled guests were begged to take their seats, while Hildur sat on her throne beside the king, which all the people of the court ranged themselves on each side of the royal couple, and the feast commenced. When it was concluded, the various guests amused themselves, some by dancing, some by singing, others by drinking and revel. But the king and queen talked together, and seemed to the herdsman to be very sad. While they were thus conversing, 3 children younger than those the man had seen before ran in and clung around the neck of their mother. Hildur received them all with a mother's love, and as the youngest was restless, put it on the ground and gave it one of her rings to play with. After the little one played a while with the ring, he lost it, and it rolled along the floor towards the herdsman, who, being invisible, picked it up without being perceived. He carefully placed it in his pocket. Of course, all search for it by the guests was in vain. When the night was far advanced, Hildur made preparations for departure, at which all people assembled showed great sorrow and begged her to remain longer. The herdsman had observed that in one corner of the hall sat an old and ugly woman who had neither received the queen with joy nor pressed her to stay any longer. And as the king perceived that Hildur addressed herself to her journey, and that neither his entreaties nor those of the assembly could induce her to stay, he went up to the old man and said to her, "Mother, rid us now of thy curse. Cause no longer my queen to live apart and afar from me. Surely her short and rare visits are more pain to me than joy." The old woman answered with a wrathful face, "Never will I depart from what I have said. My words shall hold true in all their force, and on no condition will I abolish my curse." On this the king turned from her, and going up to his wife, entreated her to the fondest and most loving terms not to depart from him. The queen answered, "The infernal power of thy mother's curse forces me to go, and perchance this may be the last time that I shall see thee. For lying as I do under this horrible ban, it is not possible that my constant murders can remain much longer secret, and then I must suffer the full penalty of crimes which I have committed against my will." While she was thus speaking, the herdsman sped from the place and across the fields to the precipice, up which he mounted as rapidly as he had come down, thanks to the magic stone. How does that help him climb? Never established. Amazing. The confidence of telling a story that explains none of its MacGuffins. I envy it. When he arrived at the rock, he put down the stone in his pocket and the bridle over his head again and awaited the coming of the Elf Queen. He had not long to wait, for very soon afterwards Hildur came up through the abyss and mounted on his back, and off they flew again to the farmhouse, where Hildur, taking the bridle from his head, placed him again in his bed and retired to her own. The herdsman, who by this time was well tired out, now considered it safe to go to sleep, which he did so soundly as to not wake till quite late on Christmas morning. Early that day the farmer rose, agitated and filled with the fear that instead of passing Christmas in joy, he should assuredly, as he so often had before, find his herdsman dead, and pass it in sorrow and mourning. So he and all the rest of the family went to the bedside of the herdsman. When the farmer had a look at him and found him breathing, he praised God aloud for his mercy in preserving the man from death. Not long afterwards the man himself woke up and got up. Wondering at his strange preservation, the farmer asked how he'd passed the night and whether he'd seen or heard anything. The man replied, "No, but I have had a very curious dream." "What was it?" asked the farmer. Upon which the man related everything that had passed in the night, circumstance for circumstance, and word for word, as well as he could remember. When he had finished his story, everyone was silent for wonder, except Hildur, who went up to him and said, "I declare you to be a liar in all that you have said, unless you can prove it by sure evidence." Not in the least abashed, the herdsman took from his pocket the ring which he had picked up on the floor in the hall in Elfland, and showing it to her said, "Though my dreams need no proof, yet here is one you will not doubtlessly deem other than a sure one. For is this not your gold ring, Queen Hildur?" Hildur answered, "It is no doubt my ring." "Happy man,
May you prosper in all you undertake, for you have released me from the awful yoke which my mother-in-law laid in her wrath upon me, and from the curse of a yearly murder." And then Hildur told the story of her life as follows. "I was born of an obscure family among the elves. Our king fell in love with me and married me in spite of the strong disapproval of his mother. She swore eternal hatred to me in her anger against her son, and said to him, 'Short shall be your joy with this fair wife of yours, for you shall see her but once a year, and that only at the expense of a murder. This is my curse upon her, and it shall be carried out to the letter. She shall go and serve in the upper world, this queen, and every Christmas Eve shall ride a man, one of her fellow servants, with this magic bridle, to the confines of Elfland, where shall pass a few hours with you, and then ride him back again till his very heart breaks with toil, and his very life leaves him. Let her thus enjoy her queenship. And this horrible fate was cling to me until I should either have these murders brought home to me and be condemned to death, or should meet with a gallant man, like this herdsman, who should have nerve and courage to follow me down into Elfland, and be able to prove afterwards that he'd been there with me and seen the customs of my people. And now I must confess that all the former herdsmen were slain by me, but no penalty shall touch me for their murders, as I committed them against my will." What do you think about that, chat? We're going to come back to that. "And as for you, O courageous man, you have dared, the first of the human beings, to explore the realms of Elfland. You have freed me from the yoke of this awful curse, and I will reward you in times to come, but not now. A deep longing for my home and my loved one impels me hence. Farewell." With these words, Hildur vanished from sight of the astonished people and was never seen again. But our friend the herdsman, leaving the service of the farmer, built a farm for himself and prospered and became one of the chief men in the country, who always ascribed with grateful thanks his prosperity to Hildur, Queen of the Elves. GS says, "This is a very weird story." Yes, it is. I mean, they're all pretty weird. Let's be honest. I'd like to point out that if I understand the bargain there, in order to see her family once a year, she had to murder a man, which means she was under duress, I guess, but she certainly wasn't, it wasn't like outside of her will to kill a bunch of people. She could have just not seen her family. You know, I mean, obviously that would have been a bad outcome for her, but also it's a pretty bad outcome for every herdsman. And I do find it very charming that, well, she was cursed, so the fact that she's a serial killer is A-okay. Is the actual ending of the story. I don't know. I don't know what to make of it, but I find it oddly charming. Even though I definitely shouldn't. All right. Well, 35 minutes. I think we could get through a third story. That one went a little quicker than I thought it would. So I guess we will do that third story. The third story of the night is the least related to our theme, as I said at the beginning, but it has some relationship. It is about a woman wronged, which I would say is the theme of, well, frankly, every fairy tale that involves a female. It's a theme in general. That's an easy one to put together. But yeah, this one is called The True Bride. It's on the longer side. I actually find it really charming. I think there's a really neat little ending. There's a really neat detail in the ending. It does something that I delight in.
that I really like from myths that not enough myths do. So I think it's worth it to stick around to the end. I'll sort of highlight it when we get to it. There's a neat little, like, I don't know, you'll see it when you get there. GS says we're supposed to suspend our morality, considering the last story. But that's a bit weird because, like, they're definitely trying to present it as a moral equation. That because she was cursed, it, wasn't a real choice. I don't know, I guess we're supposed to conclude that, like, who wouldn't kill someone to see their family? I don't know, maybe that's, I don't know. I have no insights on this. Okay. So this story is called The True Bride. It's from the book Mighty Miko, which we read last week as well. A book of Finnish fairy tales and folk tales. So it's a Finnish story. And as you can see, it has a secondary title called The Story of Ilona and the King's Son. There were once 2 orphans, a brother and a sister, who lived alone in the old farmhouse where their fathers before them had lived for many generations. The brother's name was Osmo and the sister's Ilona. Osmo was an industrious youth, but the farm was small and barren, and he was hard put to it to make a livelihood. "Sister," he said one day, "I think it might be well if I went out into the world and found work." "Do as you think best, brother," Ilona said. "I'm sure I can manage here alone." So Osmo started off, promising to come back for his sister as soon as he could give her a new home. He wandered far and wide, and at last got employment from the king's son as a shepherd. The king's son was about Osmo's age, and often when he met Osmo tending his flocks, he would stop and talk to him. One day Osmo told the king's son about his sister, Ilona. "I have wandered far over the face of the earth," he said, "and never have I seen so beautiful a maiden as Ilona." "What does she look like?" the king's son asked. Osmo drew a picture of her, and she seemed to the king's son so beautiful that he at once fell in love with her. "Osmo," he said, "if you will go home and get your sister, I will marry her." So Osmo hurried home, not by the long land route by which he'd come, but straight over the water in a boat. "Sister," he cried as soon as he saw Ilona, "you must come with me at once, for the king's son wishes to marry you." He thought Ilona would be overjoyed, but she sighed and shook her head. "What is it, sister? Why do you sigh?" "Because it grieves me to leave this old house where our fathers have lived for so many generations." "Nonsense, Ilona! What is this little old house compared to the king's castle where you'll live once you marry the king's son?" But Ilona only shook her head. "It's no use, brother. I can't bear to leave this old house until the grindstone with which our fathers for generations ground their meal is worn out." When Osmo found out she was firm, he went secretly and broke the old grindstone into small pieces. He then put the pieces together so that the stone looked the same as before. But of course, the next time Ilona touched it, it fell apart. "Now, sister, you'll come, will you not?" Osmo asked. But again, Ilona shook her head. "It's no use, brother. I can't bear to go until the old stool where our mothers have sat spinning these many generations is worn through." So again, Osmo took things into his own hands. Going secretly to the old spinning stool, he broke it, and when Ilona sat on it again, it fell to pieces. Then Ilona said she couldn't go until the old mortar, which she had been in use for generations, should fall to bits at a blow from the pestle. Osmo cracked the mortar, and the next time Ilona struck it with the pestle, it broke. Then Ilona said she couldn't go until the old worn door-sill, over which so many of their forefathers had walked, should fall to splinters at the brush of her skirts. And so Osmo secretly split the old door-sill, into thin slivers, and when next Ilona stepped over it, the brush of her skirts sent the splinters flying. "I see I must go," Ilona said, "for the house of our forefathers no longer holds me."
So she packed all her ribbons, her bodices, and skirts in a bright wooden box, and calling her little dog Pilka, she stepped into the boat, and Osmo rowed her off in the direction of the king's castle. Soon they passed a long, narrow spit of land, at the end of which stood a woman waving her arms. That is, she looked like a woman. Really, she was a Suottar, but they, of course, did not know this. Suottar is a Finnish witch, not a nice one either. "Take me in your boat," she cried. "Shall we?" Osmo asked his sister. "I don't think we ought to," Ilona said. "We don't know who she is or what she wants. She may be evil." So Osmo rowed on, but the woman kept shouting, "Hi there! Take me in your boat! Take me!" A second time, Osmo paused and asked his sister, "Don't you think we ought to take her?" "No," Ilona said. So Osmo rode on again, and at this the creature raised such a pitiful outcry, demanding what they meant, denying assistance to a poor woman, that Osmo was unable longer to refuse, and in spite of Ilona's warning, he rowed to land. Always listen to your sister, right? Suottar instantly jumped into the boat and seated herself in the middle with her face towards Osmo and her back towards Ilona. "What a fine young man," Suottar said in a whining, flattering tones. "See how strong he is at the oars. And what a beautiful girl, too. I dare say the king's son would fall in love with her if he ever saw her." Thereupon Osmo very foolishly told Suottar that the king's son had already promised to marry Ilona, and that an evil look came into Suottar's face, and she was sat silent in it for a time, biting her fingers. Then she began mumbling a spell that made Osmo deaf to what Ilona was saying, and Ilona deaf to what Osmo was saying. At last, in the distance, the towers of the king's castle appeared. "Stand up, sister," Osmo said. "Shake out your skirt and arrange your pretty ribbons. We'll soon be landing now." Ilona could see her brother's lips moving, but of course she could not hear what he was saying. "What is it, brother?" she asked. Suottar answered for him. "Osmo orders you to jump headlong into the water." "No, no," Ilona cried. "He couldn't order anything so cruel as that." Presently Osmo said, "Sister, what ails you? Don't you hear me? Shake out your skirts and arrange your pretty ribbons, for we'll be landing soon." "What is it, brother?" Ilona asked. As before, Suottar answered for him. "Osmo orders you to jump headlong into the water." "Brother, how can you order so cruel a thing?" Ilona cried, bursting into tears. "Is it for this you made me leave the home of my fathers?" A third time the Osmo said, "Stand up, sister, and shake out your skirt. Arrange your ribbons. We'll be landing now." "I can't hear you, brother. What is it you say?" Suottar turned on her fiercely and screamed, "Osmo orders you to jump headlong into the water." "If he says I must, I must," poor Ilona sobbed, and with that she leapt overboard. Osmo tried to save her, but Suottar held him back, and with her own arms rowed off, as Ilona was left to sink. "What will become of me now?" Osmo cried. "When the king's son finds I've not brought him my sister, he'll surely order my death." Nice priorities, Osmo. "Not at all," Suottar said. "Do as I say, and no harm will come to you. Offer me to the king's son, and tell him I'm your sister. He won't know the difference, and anyways, I'm sure I'm as beautiful as Ilona ever was." With that, Suottar opened the wooden box that held Ilona's clothes and helped herself to a skirt and bodice and gay-colored ribbons. She decked herself out in these, and for a little while she really did succeed in looking like a pretty young girl. So Osmo presented Suottar to the king's son as Ilona, and the king's son, because he'd given his word, married her. But before one day was past, he called Osmo to him and asked him angrily, "What did you mean by telling me your sister was beautiful?" "Isn't she beautiful?" Osmo faltered. "No! I thought she was at first, but she isn't. She's ugly and evil, and you shall pay the penalty for having deceived me." Thereupon, he ordered that Osmo be shut up in a place filled with serpents. "If you are innocent," the king's son said, "the serpents will not harm you. If you are guilty, they will devour you." As a note, this does harken back to certain old world moralities, where it was seen that, like, there was judging gods, and they would side with you if you were true and good, and not side with you if you weren't. Which is why, by the way, for the people that like Game of Thrones, trial by combat was ever a thing. Not because they thought might made you right, but that if you were right, you would have the power of a god on your side in combat and win. So this is sort of an extension of that idea. Meanwhile, poor Ilona, when she jumped into the water, sank down and down and down until she reached the Sea King's palace. Real Tir na Nog vibes here. If you don't know that, you should check out our video about Irish Heaven. They received her kindly there and comforted her, and the Sea King's son, touched by her grief and beauty, offered to marry her. But Ilona was homesick for the upper world and would not listen to him. "I want to see my brother again," she wept. He kind of ditched you pretty easily, so maybe let it go. They told her that the king's son had thrown her brother into the serpents and had married Sjotor in their stead, but Ilona still begged so pitifully to be allowed to return to the earth that at last the Sea King said, "Very well then, for 3 successive nights I will allow you to return to the upper world, but after that, never again." So they decked Ilona in the lovely jewels of the sea with great strands of pearls around her neck, and to each of her ankles they attached a long silver chains. As she rose in the water, to the sound of the chains was like the chiming of silver bells and could be heard for 5 miles. Ilona came to the surface of the water just where Osmo had landed. The first thing she saw was his boat at the water's edge, and curled up asleep in the bottom of the boat her own little dog, Pilka. "Pilka!" Ilona cried, and the little dog woke with a bark of joy and licked Ilona's hands and yelped and frisked. Then Ilona sang this magic song to Pilka. "Pili, pili, Pilka, pide. Lift the latch and slip inside. Past the watchdog in the yard. Past the sleeping men on guard. Creeping in softly as a snake. Then creep out before they wake. Pili, pili, Pilka, pide. Pili, pili, Pilka." Pilka barked and frisked and said, "Yes, mistress, I'll do whatever you bid me." Ilona gave the little dog an embroidered square of gold and silver, which she herself had worked on down in the Sea King's palace. "Take this," she said to Pilka, "and put it on the pillow where the king's son lies asleep. Perhaps when he sees it, he will know that it comes from Osmo's true sister, and that the frightful creature he's married is Sjotor. Then perhaps he will release Osmo before the serpents devour him. Go now, my faithful Pilka, and come back to me before the dawn." At no point is it explained why she can't just give him a message, by the way. So Pilka raced off to the king's palace, carrying the square of embroidery in her teeth. Ilona waited, and half an hour before sunrise the little dog came panting back. "What news, Pilka? How fares my brother, and how is my poor love, the king's son?" Osmo is still with the serpents," Pilka's answered. "But they haven't eaten him yet. I left the embroidered square on the pillow where the king's son's head was lying. Sjotor was asleep on the bed beside him where you should be, dear mistress. Sjotor's awful mouth was open and she was snoring horribly." Well, I mean, if that makes you an evil witch, we're all, aren't we? "The king's son moved uneasily, for he was troubled even in his sleep." "And did you go through the castle, Pilka?" "Yes, dear mistress." "And did you see the remains of the wedding feast?" "Yes, dear mistress, the remains of the feast that shamed the king's son, for the Sjotor served bones instead of meat. fish heads, turnip tops, and bread burned to a cinder. Good Pilka, Ilona said. Good little dog. You've done well. Now the dawn is coming, and I must go back to the Sea King's palace. But I shall come again tonight, and also tomorrow night. And do you be here waiting for me? Pilka promised, and Ilona sank down to the sea, to a clanking of chains that sounded like silver bells. The king's son heard them in his sleep, and for a moment woke and said, "What's that?"
"What's what?" snarled Hildur. "You're dreaming. Go back to sleep."
A few hours later, when he awoke again, he found the lovely square of embroidery on his pillow. "Who made this?" he cried. Hildur was busy combing her snaky locks. She turned on him quickly.
"Who made what?"
When she saw the embroidery, she tried to snatch it from him, but he held it tight.
"I made it, of course," she declared. "Who but me would sit up all night and work while you lay snoring?"
But the king's son, as he folded the embroidery, muttered to himself, "Doesn't look to me much like your work." After he ate breakfast, the king's son asked for news of Osmo. A slave was sent to the place of the servants, and when he returned, he reported that Osmo was sitting amongst them uninjured.
The old king's snake has made friends with him, he added, and has wound himself around Osmo's arm.
The king's son was amazed at this news, also relieved, for the whole affair troubled him sorely, and he was beginning to suspect a mystery. He knew an old wise woman who lived alone in a little hut on the seashore, and he decided he would go and consult her. So he went to her and told her about Osmo and how Osmo had deceived him in regard to his sister. Then he told her how the serpents, instead of devouring Osmo, had made friends with him, and last he showed her the square of lovely embroidery he'd found on his pillow that morning. "There is a mystery somewhere, Granny," he said in conclusion, "and I know not how to solve it." The old woman looked at him thoughtfully.
"My son," she said at last, "that is never Osmo's sister that you have married. Take an old woman's word. It is a Hildur. Yet Osmo's sister must be alive, and the embroidery must be a token from her. It probably means that she begs you to release her brother."
"Hildur," repeated the king's son, aghast. At first he couldn't believe such a horrible thing possible, and yet that, if it were so, would explain much. "I wonder if you're right," he said. "I must be on my guard." That night, on the stroke of midnight, to the sound of silver chimes, Ilona came floating up through the waves, and little Pilka, as she appeared, greeted her with barks of joy. As before, let's get a drink of water in before this. As before, Ilona sang,
"Peely, peely, Pilka pide, lift the latch and slip inside. Pass the watchdog in the yard, past the sleeping men on guard, creeping in softly as a snake, then creep out before they wake. Peely, peely, Pilka pile, peely, peely, Pilka."
This time Ilona gave Pilka a shirt for the king's son, beautifully embroidered. It was in gold and silver, and Ilona herself had worked it in the Sea King's palace. Pilka carried it safely to the castle and left it on the pillow where the king's son could see it as soon as he woke. Then Pilka visited the place of the serpents before the first ray of dawn was back at the seashore to reassure Ilona of Osmo's safety. Then dawn came, and Ilona, as she sank in the waves of the chime of silver bells, called out to Pilka,
"Meet me here tonight at the same hour. Fail me not, dear Pilka, for tonight it is the last night that the Sea King will allow me to come to the upper world."
Pilka, howling with grief, made a promise.
"I'll be here, dear mistress, that I will."
The king's son that morning, as he opened his eyes, saw the embroidered shirt lying on the pillow at his head, and he thought at first he must be dreaming, for it was more beautiful than any shirt had ever been worked by human fingers.
"Ah," he sighed at last. "Who made this?"
"Who made what?"
Hildur demanded rudely. When she saw the shirt, she tried to snatch it, but the king's son held it from her. Then she pretended to laugh and said,
Oh, that! I made it, of course. Do you think anyone else in the world would sit up all night and work for you while you lie there snoring? And small thanks I get for it, too.
Doesn't look to me like your work, said the king's son significantly. Again, the slave reported to him that Ozma was alive and unhurt by the serpents. Strange, thought the king's son. He took the embroidered shirt and made the wise old woman another visit.
Ah, she said when she saw the shirt. Now I understand. Listen, my prince. Last night at midnight I was awakened by the chime of silver bells. And I got up and I looked out the door. And just there at the water's edge, so close to that little boat, I saw a strange sight. A lovely maiden rose from the waves, holding in her hands the very shirt you have now. A little dog that was lying in the boat greeted her with barks of joy. She sang a magic rhyme to the dog and gave it the shirt, and off it ran. That maid, my prince, must be Ilona. She must be in the Sea King's power, and I think she is begging you to rescue her and to release her brother.
The king's son slowly nodded his head. Granny, I'm sure what you say is true. Help me to rescue Ilona, and I shall reward you richly.
Then, my son, we must act at once, for tonight, I heard Ilona say, is the last night that the Sea King will allow her to come to the upper world. Go now to the smith and have him forge you a strong iron chain and a great strong scythe, and then tonight hide you down yonder.
Sorry, I lost my spot.
In the shadow of the boat. At midnight, when you hear the silver chimes and the maiden slowly rises from the waves, throw the iron chain about her and quickly draw her to you. Then with one sweep of your scythe, cut the silver chains that are fastened to her ankles. But remember, my son, that is not all. She is under enchantment, and as you try to grasp her, the Sea King will change her to many things. A fish, a bird, a fly, I know not what. If in any form she escape you, then all is lost.
At once the king's son hurried away to the smithy, and had the smith forge him a strong iron chain and a heavy, sharp scythe. And then when night fell, he hid in the shadow of the boat and waited. Pilka snuggled up beside him. Midnight came, and to the sweet chiming as of silver bells, Ilona slowly rose from the waves, and as she began singing, Pili, pili, pilka pile. Instantly the king's son threw the strong iron chain about her and drew her to him. Then with one mighty sweep of the scythe he severed the silver chains that were attached to her ankles, and the silver chains fell chiming into the depths. Another instant, and the maiden in his arms was no maiden but a slimy fish that squirmed and wriggled and almost slipped through his fingers. He killed the fish, and lo, it was not a fish but a frightened bird that struggled to escape. And he killed the bird, and lo, it was not a bird but a writhing lizard. And so on through many transformations, growing finally small and weak until at last there was only a mosquito. He crushed this, and in his arms he found again a lovely Ilona.
Ah, dear one, he said, you are my true bride, and not Hildur, who pretended she was you. Come, we will go at once to the castle and confront her. But Ilona cried out at this. Not there, my prince, not there. Hildur, if she saw me, would kill me and devour me. Keep me from her.
Very well, my dear one, the king's son said. We'll wait until tomorrow, and after tomorrow there will be no Hildur to fear. And for that night, they took shelter in the old wise woman's hut. Ilona and the king's son and faithful little Pilka. The next morning, early, the king's son returned to the castle and had the sauna heated. And just inside the door, he had a deep hole dug and filled it with burning tar. I do wonder what servants think in these tales. Like, I want you to go to the queen's sauna and make a trap of burning tar. No questions. Then over top of the hole he stretched a brown mat, and on the brown mat a blue mat. And when all was ready he went indoors and roused Hildur.
Where have you been all night?
she demanded angrily. Forgive me this time, he begged in pretended humility, and I promise never again to be parted from my own true bride. Come now, my dear, and bathe, for the sauna is ready. Then Sjotar, who loved to have people see her go to the sauna, just as if she were a real human being, put on a long bathrobe and clapped her hands. 4 slaves appeared, 2 took up the train of her bathrobe, and 2 others supported her on either side. Slowly she marched out of the castle, across the courtyard, and over to the sauna.
They all really think I'm a human princess,
She said to herself, and she was so sure she was beautiful and admired, she tossed her head and smirked from side to side and took little mincing steps. And when she reached the sauna, she was ready to drop the bathrobe and jump over the doorsill to the steaming shelf. But the king's son whispered, "Nay, nay. Remember your dignity as a beautiful princess and walk over the blue mat." So with one more toss of her head and one more smirk of her ugly face, Sjotar stepped on the blue mat and sank into a hole of burning tar, and then the king's son quickly locked the door of the sauna and left her there to burn in the tar, for burning, you know, is the only way to destroy a Sjotar. As she burned, the last hateful thing Sjotar did was to tear out handfuls of her hair and scatter them broadcast in the air.
"Let these," she cried, yelling and cursing, "turn into mosquitoes and worms and moth and trouble mankind forever."
So that's where mosquitoes come from. Then her yells grew fainter, and at last she ceased altogether, and the king's son knew that it was now safe to bring Ilona home. First, however, he had Osmo released from the place of the serpent and asked his forgiveness for the unjust punishment. Couldn't have done that sooner. Then he and Osmo together went to the hut of the old wise woman, and there with tears of happiness the brother and sister were united. The king's son, to show his gratitude to the old wise woman, begged her to accompany them to the castle, and presently they all set forth with Pilka, frisking ahead and barking for joy. The day there was a new wedding feast spread at the castle, and this time it was not bones and fish heads and burnt crusts, but such food as the king's son had not tasted for many a day. To celebrate his happy marriage, the king's son made Osmo his chamberlain and gave Pilka a new beautiful collar. "Now at last," Ilona said, "I am glad I left the house of my forefathers." And that is the end of The True Bride from Mighty Miko. And hey, look, we lined up perfectly on time. That was a lot of story this week. All right, well, this has been Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory. If you want to read some of my own work or some of the other authors in Varietals, you can go to varietal-literature.ca, which is in the description below. Links to stories. If you want to follow us on Instagram or Twitter, it's at varietal_lit. Please give this video a like if you like it, and subscribe if you want to keep up with stuff, or just drop in when you can. And we'll be back on Thursday at 6:30, where we have the Varietal show, which is where we do live writing, and it's a little sillier and a little less structured. And if you think you'll enjoy that, come by and check it out. Otherwise, I'm back here Tuesday at 6:30 next week, where we're going to read more tales from the past. GS says that was wild. I agree. I really like, the thing that I really like is when they explain things in the world with a story. And the idea that moths and mosquitoes and worms and things that are pests to us was the hair of a Sjotar is, charming to me for some reason. Thank you so much for coming by and talking, GS. Thank you for everybody who dropped by to watch. I've been Rory. I'll keep the fire warm. And you have yourself a good sleep.